The Milwaukee Bucks, after starting the season with an abysmal 2-8 record, have since completely turned their year around, going 9-1 over their last 10 games. Many people, including myself, were dismissive of the Milwaukee Bucks as legitimate contenders after this poor start, but since this recent streak, I want to answer the question, were those alarm bells premature and the Milwaukee Bucks are legitimate contenders? Or is this just a really strong stretch against some relatively weak opponents, and those very same alarm bells will be ringing when the postseason comes around? Hello everybody, welcome to Also Rusty Buckets. If you're over on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and drop a like. And if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience, check us out over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So after their very, very bad start to the season, the Bucks were not getting a lot of favorability from me. I was pretty harsh and pretty dismissive of them right out of the gate because very many of the issues that had persisted for them last year were ever present right out of the gate, and even worse than they were beforehand, especially worse given the context of how fucking bad their head coach Doc Rivers is. So with that looming in the background, Giannis and Dame not really looking like they have as good of a chemistry together as you would prefer, as we had imagined when that trade went down, and the role players on this team not looking very good, especially Bobby Portis, who's consistently getting called out for his terrible play, I was like, yeah, I just don't think this team has it, especially in an Eastern Conference where what are the odds that you can possibly beat that Boston Celtics team? They didn't look very good. And on top of that, the Cleveland Cavaliers have been so damn good this year that, again, just seems like an uphill battle that they could not compete in. However, over their last 10 games, after this completely dogshit start, they have looked unstoppable. Now, a lot of this has to be chalked up to, call it hate if you want to, but this is just the reality of what has happened. It is a strength of schedule thing in large part because they played the Celtics and the Cavaliers twice at the start of the season and lost all 4 of those games. Their only wins came against the Utah Jazz and the Philadelphia 76ers, some of the worst teams in the league, and they managed to lose to the Brooklyn Nets and Chicago Bulls as well. Also taking a pretty bad loss to a New York Knicks team that otherwise kind of struggled out of the gate, but had no issue taking care of the Bucks. So bear in mind that this was a rough schedule and they lost a bunch of games. Then you go to all these games they've been winning, and what do you know? They're playing the Raptors, the Pistons, the Hornets, the Bulls, the Pacers, the Miami Heat, the Wizards, and the Pistons again. The only L they took over that stretch was a 1-point loss to the Charlotte Hornets, and they did get a 1-point win against the Houston Rockets, who are one of the better teams in the NBA and the Western Conference thus far. So they have beaten a good top-of-the-line team over this stretch, but they only did it once. Every other team that they played is below 500, and I'm pretty sure every other team that they have played is not even in the playoff seeding in their conference. So that obviously is a stretch of basketball that is not that impressive given that context. However, there are things about how they have managed to be as dominant as they have that I think can translate into winning basketball against better teams. So their upcoming schedule, 3 of their next 5 games are against the Cavaliers, the Celtics, and the Orlando Magic. And I think a lot of how we feel about this team could be predicated on how they perform in that stretch. Not necessarily saying that they need to win those games, but they definitely can't look as pathetic as they did at the start of the season the moment that they play a legitimately talented opponent. So that is a huge area of concern, and I would advise you to monitor those games specifically because that is the true test here. However, I don't think that, they're only beating bad teams is necessarily evidence of not being a good team, because guess what good teams do all the time? They beat bad teams and they beat them rather decidedly. Most of these wins are double-digit leads, and to me, being able to just have no concern and easily walk through all of these bad teams is a staple of a contender, and I would chalk up a lot of their poor start to the season to things that are the law of averages. You know, things are going to return back to normal. Shooting is going to level out. The defense is going to improve. The chemistry is going to improve. The players are going to get in better shape as the season goes along. You can argue that's the case for all teams, and it is true. However, the Bucks started so poorly that it was all but inevitable that they were going to swing back a little bit more positively than that. They were not about to be one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference. That was very clear. It also helps that the East is remarkably uncompetitive, and they were back in the playoff picture only a couple of games into this win streak, because you can have a below 500 record and still be one of the best teams in the East. So as of right now, they are 11-9, which puts them as the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. Last win against the Pistons, and they have now bolstered a defensive rating of 13th in the league, which is a pretty dramatic improvement because it was towards the bottom of the league at the very start of the year, and they're 8th in offensive rating. A lot of this can also be chalked up to Giannis has been on an absolute tear. As of right now, he is leading the league in scoring at just under 33 points per game. He has had a double-double in all but 3 of the games he has played thus far. As a whole, in 35 minutes of action, he is averaging 33, 12, and nearly 7 assists, just under 1.5 blocks, and 61.7% from the field. It's interesting where if you look at his true shooting percentage, it's only 1.9 points better, which is very funny for someone who shoots as many free throws as he does. Obviously, his three-point volume is almost non-existent now, which I think is definitely for the better. But the fact that he gets to the line as much as he does, but he only shoots about 60%, means that his true shooting percentage is not all that much better than his field goal percentage. But if you're only strictly taking twos, well, then it is what it is. A lot of this has been mid-range shooting from Giannis as well. So the fact that he has managed to be this efficient inside the arc, despite the fact that he has improved his mid-range volume substantially, is really compelling. He is taking more mid-range shots than he ever has before, and he is hitting them more than he ever has before. It's not just a matter of the defense giving him these clean-ass looks and him making them, because, I mean, obviously they're playing off of him for the drive to an extent, but he's consistently hitting contested ones. He's consistently hitting them where he's like fading away, where a defender gets a very significant contest on the shot, and it just doesn't seem to matter. He is currently on pace to have the most long two-pointers of any player in the entire league if he maintains how well he has done on those shots so far. So on that front, that is another thing where you can argue, how well is this going to hold up? Is Giannis actually going to legitimately be one of the best mid-range shooters in the league for the entire season? Or is this just him on a hot streak, keeping this team afloat? We'll get more to that conversation later. Let's talk about Damian Lillard, who has also been substantially better over this recent stretch. His three-point percentage has improved, his assists per game numbers have improved, and his points per game has remained relatively about the same. A big criticism I have had for Damian Lillard this year is that I just don't know if he's a natural enough high-volume playmaker to be the number one orchestrator of the offense. Oftentimes, I feel like Giannis is the better passer between the two of them, but Dame obviously has more ball handling responsibilities. So the fact that his assists have gone up over this stretch, I think, is a positive sign. I feel like he's been a little bit more willing to find Giannis. There was a play that they connected on during this stretch where they had an alley-oop in the half-court set, and I was like, man, that was gorgeous. Why haven't I seen that 200 times? I don't think the synergy between him and Giannis has necessarily been what I would like it to be, even still. But as a whole, they're averaging nearly 60 points per game together, so I can't exactly act like they're not a positive offensive duo. Maybe not as positive as I would like them to be, but Dame has his 4th highest true shooting percentage of his career, and I think overall this is a very positive sign. On top of that, they did get one win without Giannis, and that was thanks entirely to Damian Lillard having a huge carry job performance against the Miami Heat. So nice to see that they can win a game without Giannis. Obviously, that is one of the better aspects of Damian Lillard on his team, I think, is that when there is not Giannis, you have Dame, and when Dame is not playing with Giannis, he plays like the Dame that we know and love. But moving on to Dame's shot chart, he has, I would guess, one of the highest assisted percentages on threes of his career. He's shooting 40% from three in wins, and he's at 71% unassisted as a whole. Pretty standard shot chart for Dame, but I appreciate that he has been more of a catch and shoot guy than he has been in times in the past. But speaking of shooting, this is another big thing for the Bucks that has dramatically improved and is a big part of the reason they've been so good. So let's just go down the list of some guys who were struggling with their jumpers to start the year. Gary Trent Jr. was shooting the ball so bad in his first 8 games that I was concerned that he might not be a legitimate rotational NBA player anymore. However, his 23% clip that he started with has improved to 52% over his last 10 games. Bobby Portis, who is someone who I have been extremely critical of and am going to continue to be because I still don't think he's a very good player, he at the very least is now hitting his three-pointers when on top of the bad defense, on top of the ball stopping, he was also shooting 24% from 3 in his first 11 games. He is now shooting 52% in his last 8. Brook Lopez, someone who I am also pretty critical of in regards to his three-point shooting for its inconsistency. Well, in the first 10 games, just under 28% from 3. Over his last 10 games, just under 43%, while increasing his volume at that. And then Damian Lillard, as I mentioned, had increased his percentages. First 10 games, just under 35% from 3. Last 7, just under 40%. On top of that, Taurean Prince and AJ Green have both been lights out throughout the year, and they have managed to maintain that throughout this streak as well. So we have multiple guys. We have essentially 3 dudes who are shooting 50+% from 3 over this stretch, and 3 other dudes who are shooting 40% over this stretch. Dame just under 40%, barely, but considering his high volume, you get my point. The floor spacing has been fucking great over this stretch, just as good as you can conceivably ask for. Taurean Prince is shooting 54% from 3 right now, which is leading the league percentage-wise. Taurean Prince is a player that I saw get clowned on so much last year, because if you commit the sin of playing for the Los Angeles Lakers while not being a top 30 player in the NBA, then Lord knows you're going to get a shitload of criticism. But in reality, he is a good 3-and-D wing, and if he's going to keep hitting threes like this, he's a damn good 3-and-D wing. AJ Green is somebody who I was really the only silver lining that I could see for the Milwaukee Bucks' very bad start to the season. He is a 40% three-point shooter on high volume, and he's a positive defender, good length, good decision-making, and very little to complain about. Another guy who can be a prominent part of the rotation. In fact, his minutes per game only continue to increase, and I would not be surprised if he ended up being the starter by the end of the year. So the shooting has been great across the board. Dame has improved pretty dramatically as the season has gone along, and Giannis is having a historic season. All of that is happening at the same time that they are playing teams like the Pistons and the Hornets and, a bunch of shit-ass teams. So it's hard to say if this is a hot streak against bad opponents and the overall concerns that were expressed earlier on are still very much valid, or if we were just kind of ringing the alarm bell too early based on too small of a sample size. I did make the point when I was discussing their struggles earlier on of, yeah, they're probably still going to be a playoff team and they can turn this around. They're not going to bottom out and be one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference, but I didn't expect them to turn around as quickly as they did, for sure. So all of this brings us to the question of how legitimate is this really? How much of this is them finally being fine, or is it just Giannis carrying? Is it just a matter of the strength of schedule? Are they not actually that good? They've just simply played weaker opponents and they're managing to squeak by on the basis of that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, beating bad teams is important. Beating them handedly is important, which they've done for the most part. And I don't know if I can how to express this properly. You still have to hit shots. Regardless of if you're not playing the strongest defense in the world, you can play a bad defense and still have a bad performance because your guys just simply are not hitting the looks that they are getting. If they look like a smooth machine that is consistently getting good looks and consistently hitting them, sure, even if they're playing teams that don't have the best defense in the world, I still think there's plenty there to think that they can carry that over versus good defenses. Not to the extent that they have, but to an extent that still makes them very much competitive with those teams. The other thing is the defense has improved. I can't personally chalk that up to anything specifically. I don't really think there's that much that has changed systematically. I just think they're playing defense a little bit better, especially Giannis, who I was actually arguing earlier on in the year had become overrated defensively because I was just not liking what I was seeing from him on that end for the first 2 or 3 games that I had watched of him in that year, but he's improved there as well. I also want to highlight some on-off numbers real quick. Holy shit, Bobby Portis is fucking detrimentally awful. 15 points worse offensively as a whole versus with him and the opponent in the consideration. Gary Trent Jr. also not been great thus far. Giannis not even ranking that high in these numbers. And Andre Jackson Jr., I asked Bucks fans this when I was talking about the silver lining of AJ Green earlier on. Andre Jackson also seems to be a silver lining, but one that I understand significantly less. I'm not really sure what he does that makes him as impactful as he is, so I'm posing that to the Bucks fans in the audience. What about Andre Jackson has been this good? Because I don't really get it. Every time I have watched him, he's mostly just been there. Maybe he's doing some subtle shit that I'm missing. One way or the other, looks like another guy that could potentially be a rotational piece, and a team that was severely lacking in the depth department in my eyes based on that stretch because of how bad these guys were playing, because Bobby Portis doesn't look worthy of being in the rotation, because Gary Trent doesn't look worthy of being in the rotation. Pat Connaughton definitely didn't look like he was worthy of being in the rotation, but luckily he finally is not. The depth suddenly looks a lot better than I previously thought that it did. Brook Lopez isn't falling off. Bobby Portis is at least being an offensive threat, even if he is still a net negative defender and a ball stopper. So the depth I feel better about. The shooting I feel better about. The offensive system I feel better about. Damian Lillard's role in the offense I feel better about. Giannis having a historic season I feel pretty fucking good about. And the fact that all of this is happening under the tutelage of Doc Rivers and Darvin Ham is probably the biggest shock out of all of this. The other thing to bring up, what does this mean for the concerns about a Giannis trade, whether that be this season versus the offseason? I think it at least quiets those conversations for a while. And how loud they get will be determined by especially this upcoming stretch, but how long this ends up holding up. There's stuff like the Giannis and Dame synergy stuff. The inconsistency with the shooting has me worried that maybe I'm just getting a little too overhyped based off of a recent stretch. So there's stuff that could come back to bite this team. And I will not say confidently in any capacity that I think they have a strong chance of competing with Boston. And I would still definitely take the Cleveland Cavaliers over them in the current moment. Wouldn't even be shocked if I felt like the Magic were better if when Paulo comes back with Franz, it ends up working pretty well instead of being awkward. Interested to see how that ends up going. But I think they are in the serious contender conversation. I just don't think they're at the forefront of it. I would put them in a B-tier contender category. I pretty much always categorize contenders as A or B tier, like the true front runners, the true likely teams to win, and then teams that could conceivably beat them. I think the Bucks are back in the they could conceivably beat the Celtics conversation, but I'm still not going to be ready to crown them as like some super dangerous team in the Eastern Conference. Another thing worth mentioning is that Chris Middleton hasn't been factored into this equation at all. Now you might be thinking, Chris Middleton, isn't that guy washed? No, not really. I just think because of his injuries, he has taken a lesser approach on the offensive end over the last 2 seasons. And when you look at how he performed versus the Indiana Pacers in the postseason last year, 24 points per game on good efficiency with an increased offensive role, I think Chris Middleton is mostly a similar player to what he was in the past. And he brings a dynamic to this team that it's another body who can play 35 plus minutes per game in a postseason setting. He is a good three-point shooter, a good shot creator, a really good passer, which is another weakness of this team, I think, is that after Dame and Giannis, you're almost entirely surrounded by players who are not strong decision makers, not strong playmakers. So that's something that will hopefully be improved. by the addition of Chris Middleton. More spacing, also in terms of lineup balancing, like being able to have Chris Middleton staggered in lineups where when Dame's on the floor, you have Chris, or if it's just Giannis on the floor, you have Chris. However you want to balance that out to where you have more than just one dude being entirely predicated on the shot creating when you don't have both of them on the floor at the same time. So Chris's return also has a strong factor in all of this. I think their rotational pieces continuing to be strong three-point shooters is a very strong factor. I have no doubt that Giannis is continuing to be dominant, and I have less doubt that Damian Lillard is going to continue to be really good. I don't know. The whole equation here is coming out to a lot of gray. I don't have an outright answer for you, but what I will say is that I was wrong to hit the panic button as early as I did. I think everybody else was. The extent in which they did that varies, but for the most part, people have been clowning on the Bucks and suggesting that they are an unserious team after their rough start. And sure, that rough start might be indicative of larger issues that will spring up in a postseason setting, but I definitely wouldn't describe the Bucks as unserious at this point. So yeah, the Bucks are turning it around, and we'll see in this upcoming stretch if they're really real or if this was just a matter of strength of schedule. But with that said, shout out to Rudy for editing this video. That is it. Goodbye.